The observation dome of orbital station Prometheus offered a perfect view of the cosmos, endless darkness punctuated by distant stars, each one potentially harboring worlds and civilizations. But today, that beautiful void felt like a coffin. Dr. Sarah stood motionless, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the holographic display. The data was impossible, unthinkable, yet undeniably real. The distress beacon from 442b had gone silent 3 weeks ago, not gradually fading into static, but stopping abruptly, mid-transmission, mid-scream. The final message, replayed on an endless loop, burned into her memory like a brand. Control, this is New Haven Command. We have multiple unidentified contacts breaking atmosphere. They're not responding to hails, weapons systems powering up. Defensive platforms are, my God, they're beautiful and they're killing us. Static. Just silence, and beneath that silence, the absence of 50,000 human lives. New Haven wasn't some distant, abstract colonial settlement. Sarah had walked those red dust plains. She'd attended the dedication ceremony when the biological domes first came online, watched the first crops grow under alien sunlight. She'd drunk coffee in the cafeteria with engineers and scientists who'd poured their souls into building humanity's future among the stars. The colony represented more than just expansion. It was proof that humanity could survive anywhere, adapt to anything. The archaeological discoveries alone had revolutionized humanity's understanding of panspermia and the distribution of life across the galaxy. The genetic research conducted in New Haven's laboratories was years ahead of anything Earth could achieve. And now it was a grave. Admiral's voice cut through her spiral of thoughts. She hadn't heard him enter. The man moved like a ghost, 60 years of military service having honed him into something almost supernatural in his efficiency. His weathered face, carved by decades commanding humanity's fleet, bore an expression she'd never seen before, controlled fury barely contained behind a mask of professionalism. "The council convenes in 1 hour," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her at the observation window. "President is demanding answers. The Colonial Defense Committee wants strategic recommendations. Military advisors are already screaming for retaliation." Sarah's throat tightened. "We don't even know who they were, no database match, no previous encounters, nothing. These ships, they weren't anything we've before. The energy signatures, the weapons technology, it's like they came from a completely different branch of advancement." "That's the terrifying part," replied, his voice dropping lower. "We've spent 200 years mapping known space, identifying civilizations, establishing trade routes and diplomatic channels. We thought we understood the galaxy. We thought we were safe." He turned to face her directly, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that frightened her more than the destruction of New Haven. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. The certainty of a man who understood what was coming. "They've declared war," he said flatly. "Maybe they didn't mean to, maybe they were testing us, but they destroyed an entire human colony. 50,000 people, Sarah, families, children, and they did it with apparent ease." "What does the council want?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "They want to know if we can respond. Not diplomatically, not with a negotiation team, but with force. If we can build a fleet large enough to defend ourselves against whatever civilization possesses the capability to destroy New Haven in what looks like hours." His jaw clenched. "And if we can't, they want to know how many more New Havens we can expect before Earth itself comes under fire." Sarah looked back at the stars, imagining hostile ships sliding between them, moving with terrible purpose toward human space. "We can build a fleet," she whispered. "How big?" demanded. Sarah closed her eyes, doing rapid calculations in her mind, extrapolating from existing production capabilities and theoretical maximums. The number that emerged was so large it seemed absurd. 700,000 warships, she said quietly. Nodded slowly as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then that's what we'll build, and may God help anyone who stands in our way." Order went out from Earth at 600 hours GMT, transmitted simultaneously to every human facility in the solar system and beyond. It was just 7 words, but those 7 words would reshape civilization. Full mobilization. Build 700,000 WARSHIPS, Priority Alpha. Within minutes, the sleeping giant of human industry began to stir. On Mars, in the vast underground manufacturing complexes that had quietly expanded over decades, assembly line workers received emergency notifications. The machines around them, dormant for years, relics of an earlier era of military production, suddenly hummed to life. Engineers rushed to their stations, their minds struggling to process the scale of what they were being asked to accomplish. The asteroid factories of the belt exploded into action. Automated mining operations that had focused on resource extraction suddenly shifted entirely to shipyard operations. Hollowed-out asteroids, previously used for storage and habitation, were rapidly converted into production facilities. Robots that had spent years moving or now assembled hull plating. Furnaces that had refined materials for civilian infrastructure now shaped military-grade armor. In the orbital rings of Earth, the grand shipyards of humanity responded like a single organism awakening from hibernation. The Singapore Defense Works, the Tokyo Naval Yards, the Berlin Innovation Complex, facilities that represented centuries of accumulated human engineering expertise, transitioned from civilian to military production overnight. Dr. James stood in the cavernous heart of the Singapore facility, watching as workers he'd never seen before rushed through corridors, shouting coordinates and specifications into communicators. At 72 years old, he'd spent his entire career designing civilian transport ships, elegant vessels designed for comfort and efficiency, not destruction. His hands had never touched weapons design. His mind had never contemplated the mathematics of death. Until now. Doctor, a young woman's voice cut through the chaos. Barely 30, with brilliant eyes and coffee-stained sleeves, rushed toward him clutching a data tablet. She'd been his lead engineering assistant for 3 years, working on long-range cargo haulers. Now she was being asked to help design the first destroyer of a fleet that didn't yet exist. The specifications came down from command, said breathlessly. They want the first combat vessel operational in 90 days. A destroyer-class warship with integrated weapons systems, adaptive armor, and a fusion reactor rated for sustained combat operations. Took the tablet, his eyes scanning the requirements. The specifications were aggressive, impossibly so by civilian standards, but this wasn't civilian work anymore. 90 days is impossible, he said quietly. That's what I told them, replied, a slight smile crossing her exhausted face. They said it's also impossible that New Haven was destroyed, but here we are. Something shifted in his mind. The weight of it, the absolute magnitude of what humanity was being asked to accomplish, suddenly clarified his purpose. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about comfort or elegance or the perfect civilian specifications he'd spent decades perfecting. This was about survival. Get every available engineer into this facility, he commanded. Contact the Tokyo Yards and Berlin Complex. We're sharing designs in real time. And get me the weapons specialists from military archives. If we're building destroyers, they'd better be the most lethal things ever to sail the void. Across the solar system, similar scenes were unfolding. Entire industries that had nearly gone extinct were suddenly resurrected. Old factories that hadn't produced military hardware in 50 years fired up their ancient furnaces. Engineers who'd never worked on weapons systems found themselves collaborating with weapons specialists who'd never managed civilian production. The Japanese Automated Defense Network began sharing specifications with American weapons developers. Russian kinetic engineers worked alongside German energy physicists. Chinese industrial planners coordinated seamlessly with Brazilian logistics experts. Ancient rivalries, set aside in the face of existential necessity, faded into irrelevance. Universities shifted their research entirely toward applied military technology. Agricultural stations increased production schedules to feed the workers who would build humanity's fleet. Medical facilities prepared for the inevitable injuries and stress-related illnesses that would come from sustained, frantic labor. By the end of the first week, humanity was committed. The machinery of civilization had been retooled. The hammer was being forged. And it would be ready to strike. The transmission arrived unannounced, intercepted by Earth's deep space communication arrays at 200 hours. It was encrypted using a protocol that human cryptographers had never encountered before, ancient, elegant, and utterly foreign. When the AI finally cracked it after 17 hours of continuous processing, the message it contained changed everything. We come bearing warning. Request immediate diplomatic audience with Earth leadership. Matter of extreme galactic significance. The Dominion's ambassador arrived 3 days later aboard a vessel that made even the most experienced starship captains pause. It was beautiful in an alien way. Organic curves that suggested biological engineering rather than mechanical construction. Surfaces that seemed to shift between metallic and crystalline textures as light played across them. Ambassador Ho's was even more striking in person. Her exoskeleton shimmered between deep purple and electric blue, with patterns that seemed to flow across her chitinous armor like living things. Multiple eyes, 3 primary and 4 secondary, tracked movement with unsettling precision. Her mandibles, delicate despite their obvious strength, clicked nervously as she was ushered into the Earth Council chambers. President Maya sat at the head of an impossibly long table, flanked by military advisors, intelligence chiefs, and diplomatic representatives from every major Earth nation. The tension in the room was palpable. Humanity had been attacked, and now an alien ambassador was requesting an audience. The possibilities ranged from terrible to catastrophic. "Ambassador," began formally, "your arrival is unexpected. Earth appreciates this diplomatic outreach, but we must be direct. What brings you to our space at this critical moment?" Ho's mandibles clicked in what the universal translator identified as the equivalent of a sigh. "President, I come with knowledge that will reshape your understanding of the galaxy. 3 weeks ago, your colony at 442b was destroyed. You do not know by whom, you do not know why, and you certainly do not know what comes next." Admiral leaned forward, his weathered face darkening. "You know who attacked us." "I know of them," Hose corrected, her primary eyes fixing on with laser focus. "I do not know them personally. This is the critical distinction. A civilization has emerged from what we call the deep expanse, a region of space that most advanced species have learned to avoid. They call themselves the Collective, and they are aggressive." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "How aggressive?" asked quietly. "They have conquered 17 civilizations in the past 300 years, Hose replied, moving to the holographic display at the center of the table. Her manipulation of the technology was fluid, practiced. She activated a star map that showed a vast region of space marked in ominous red. "This is the extent of territory as of our last confirmed intelligence. They have remained largely contained within their home region, but that is changing." The ambassador expanded the map, showing probe signatures and resource surveys extending outward from space like questing fingers. 18 months ago, their reconnaissance missions began penetrating into adjacent territories. They are mapping your space, calculating distances, assessing threats. Most concerning, we have detected massive fleet assembly operations. She highlighted a region marked Expanse, and the assembled world leaders felt their breath catch. Hundreds of thousands of contact signatures, organized in patterns that screamed military organization. "Fleet size," demanded. "Conservative estimate, 2 million warships, possibly more. They are still building." The room erupted. Shouts of disbelief, accusations that there was lying, demands for verification. But remained silent, her mind calculating rapidly. 2 million warships. Humanity had perhaps 200,000 combat-capable vessels in total, scattered across the solar system and colony worlds. "Why come to us?" Minister from China asked sharply. "If this threat is so grave, why not unite all civilizations immediately?" "Because," Ho said slowly, her eyes glinting with something that might have been sadness or resignation, "the Dominion has learned through bitter experience that revealing intelligence capabilities attracts unwanted attention. We were observing, determining the appropriate response. But your colony's destruction suggests that observation is no longer sufficient." "What do you want from us?" asked. "Alliance," Hose replied simply. "The Collective threatens us both. They can contribute 400,000 warships to a defensive coalition. Your mobilization efforts, we are aware of them, suggest you will add significant capability as well. Combined, we might present a credible deterrent." Stood slowly, her mind already calculating the implications. "Ambassador, your timing is fortunate. Humanity is already mobilizing. The question isn't whether we'll fight. The question is how large our coalition will be." She turned to her military advisors. "Contact the immediately, then the Ascendant Collective, then every spacefaring civilization we have diplomatic relations with. Tell them what the ambassador has shared. Tell them we're forming a grand coalition. And tell them we're preparing for war on a scale the galaxy has never witnessed." Ho's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that, for the first time, carried overtones of something almost like hope. The diplomatic communications that went out from Earth in the hours following the ambassador's revelation were like ripples spreading across a still pond, each one carrying the weight of existential threat to civilizations across the galaxy. The responded first. Commander Eth, the military leader of the proud avian civilization, received the message in the midst of a ceremonial hunt across the windswept plains of there. They were warriors by nature, a species that had evolved in violent skis, where survival meant dominance of the air itself. When they learned of the threat, their response was immediate and visceral. "We pledge 800,000 warships," Eth announced, his magnificent wings spread in a gesture of martial commitment. "The do not cower before threats. We have faced extinction before and emerged victorious. The collective will learn what it means to challenge a warrior species." The Ascendant Collective responded with crystalline logic. The silicon-based civilization, which existed in structures of pure mathematical beauty, analyzed the strategic situation through probability matrices and outcome projections. Their vessels, grown rather than built, existing as living geometries of impossible complexity, would contribute 600,000 ships to the coalition. "The mathematics are compelling," their representative stated in the flat, emotionless tones of their kind. "Coalition probability of victory against collective, 73.4% if full mobilization is achieved. Probability of mutual annihilation, 18.6%. Probability of coalition defeat and extinction, 8%. These odds are acceptable. We will contribute our resources." The Trading Federation surprised everyone. A species known for peaceful commerce and diplomatic negotiation, they had built their civilization on trade and mutual benefit rather than military dominance. They had no significant standing army, no weapons manufacturers of note. Yet when contacted about the coalition, their economic council made a decision that would reshape galactic power structures. "We commit 300,000 warships," their representative announced. "Though we are not warriors by nature, we understand that some threats demand military response. We will build our fleet, we will learn to fight, and we will stand with our allies against extinction." Within weeks, the Grand Coalition had assembled a military force so vast that no previous conflict in recorded galactic history could compare. Humanity, 700,000 warships. Dominion, 400,000 warships. Ascendancy, 800,000 warships. Ascendant Collective, 600,000 warships. Trading Federation, 300,000 warships. Total, 2.8 million warships, with more being pledged from secondary civilizations. On Earth, the full scope of humanity's commitment became terrifyingly apparent. Dr. Sarah stood in a newly constructed production facility on Luna, a facility that had been built literally from moon dust and asteroid iron, constructed in 3 weeks by automated systems working without pause. Around her, the first destroyer was taking shape, its skeleton of titanium and carbon composite hull plating forming an elegant, lethal silhouette. "We're at 3 destroyers per week," reported, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She'd been awake for 37 hours straight, coordinating with production facilities across the solar system. "The Tokyo yards are producing 5 corvettes per week. The Berlin complex has shifted entirely to fighter production. They're building at a rate of 200 per week." "And the asteroid factories?" asked. "Exponential growth. We started with 3 active facilities. Now we have 17. Another 20 are being converted. At full capacity, we're looking at 3,000 total vessels per week across all ship classes." Nodded slowly, processing the implications. 700,000 warships, at 3,000 per week, that was. She did the mathematics quickly. 233 weeks, just over 4 years of sustained, maximum effort production. "We don't have 4 years," she said quietly. "No," agreed. "We have 8 months before the coalition needs to be combat ready. We need to accelerate." "How?" demanded. "We're already running every facility at maximum capacity. Workers are pulling 12-hour shifts. Materials are being consumed at rates that exceed mining production." Smiled grimly. "Then we mine faster, we build more facilities, we redirect resources from every non-essential sector of civilization. We do what humans do when we're pressed to the wall, we innovate." Across human space, the machinery of total war mobilization continued to accelerate. Manufacturing plants that hadn't produced weapons in 50 years fired up again. University research programs pivoted entirely toward military applications. Agricultural output was maximized to feed the vast workforce required to build an armada. On Mars, in the Belt, on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, humanity transformed itself into a civilization of builders, engineers, and soldiers. The hammer was being forged in the fires of necessity, and it would be ready. But the question that haunted every decision-maker in human space remained unanswered. Would it be ready in time? The Battle of Crimson Gate would be remembered forever, not as humanity's finest hour, but as the moment when the species learned what true warfare meant at galactic scale. Admiral stood in the tactical command center of the Earth's Resolve, a dreadnought-class vessel so massive that it could serve as a mobile command center for entire fleet operations. Around him, holographic displays painted a picture of controlled chaos. 2 million coalition warships arranged in carefully coordinated formations, their weapon systems powered to full capacity, their pilots and crews trained to a razor's edge through weeks of intensive preparation. Against them floated 2.3 million contacts. All coalition forces, this is command, his voice broadcast across every ship in the fleet. Weapons hot. Rules of engagement are active. Prepare for sustained combat operations. May whatever gods we believe in have mercy on their souls, because we won't. The battle began not with a dramatic charge, but with a cascade of long-range strikes that turned the void into a hell of unleashed energy. The first salvo came from humanity's destroyer force, ships designed and built in frantic months of maximum production, piloted by crews who trained for weeks in simulation and had never seen actual combat. Their kinetic weapons reached out across millions of kilometers, targeting the densely packed formations with mathematical precision. The response was immediate and devastating. Energy weapons fired from alien platforms, their technology refined across centuries of military development. Coherent beams of plasma and exotic particle streams tore through coalition vessels with horrifying efficiency. The legendary human battleship that had been the pride of Earth's fleet took a direct hit from an energy cannon that seemed to open a hole in reality itself. The ship's shields flared once, twice, then collapsed under the overwhelming power input. They exploded in a nuclear-bright burst of annihilation, taking 12,000 human souls with it. It was the first major casualty. It would not be the last. Casualty reports coming in, Tactical Officer Commander Torres called out, her voice steady despite the horror of the data flowing across her displays. The is gone. The Mars Rising has lost main power. 17 coalition cruisers destroyed in the opening salvo. Estimated casualties, 200,000 personnel. 200,000 people, dead in seconds. The number was so vast it seemed almost abstract. But didn't have time for the weight of those numbers to settle on him. All vessels maintain formation, return fire with everything we have. Concentrate on those heavy cruisers on the left flank. They are their command centers. The coalition forces, despite their losses, began to execute with terrifying precision. The warrior-bred and living for combat dove their swift attack craft directly into the formation, their energy weapons creating cascades of destruction. Though with their mastery of deep space tactics, coordinated support fire that allowed coalition vessels to press forward despite murderous opposition. But there were no easy prey. Their formations, though more chaotic than coalition tactics, demonstrated a brutal effectiveness born from centuries of conquest. Ships that should have been destroyed by coalition fire kept fighting. Weapons that seemed impossible kept firing. They seemed willing, perhaps even eager, to trade casualties with the coalition at any ratio. For 6 hours, the battle raged with undiminished fury. The void became a graveyard. Debris fields grew so thick that sensor arrays struggled to track individual contacts. Radiation from destroyed reactors painted the background of space in colors that ranged from brilliant blue to deep crimson. The cosmic background radiation spiked to dangerous levels. The very fabric of space seemed to scream under the assault of so much unleashed energy. Then, gradually, the momentum shifted. Coalition coordination, refined through weeks of training, began to overcome numerical advantage. The assault wings flanked the enemy position. Support vessels provided covering fire. The Ascendant Collective's crystalline-hulled ships, nearly impossible to damage, pressed forward relentlessly. Merchant vessels, hastily converted to combat roles, provided logistical support that kept the coalition fleet functioning despite the carnage. And humanity's destroyers, cheap, fast, and devastating, swarmed through the formation like piranhas, concentrating fire on single targets until they ceased to exist. The fleet began to break formation. "Enemy contacts retreating," Torres reported, her voice carrying a note of almost disbelieving relief. "They're establishing a defensive position approximately 5 million kilometers ahead. They're not making a full retreat. They're taking a stand." Studied the tactical display, understanding the implications instantly. They had learned from this battle. They were preparing for the next engagement, and they were positioning themselves in a way that suggested they had no intention of running. "Signal all coalition forces," commanded quietly. "Stand down from immediate combat status but maintain yellow alert. Repair damaged vessels, triage casualties, and someone get me a comprehensive damage assessment." The numbers, when they came back, were sobering. 150,000 coalition warships destroyed or disabled beyond rapid repair. Hundreds of millions of casualties, material losses that would require months to replace. But the losses were worse. Over 300,000 confirmed destroyed, with several 100,000 more damaged. The war had begun in earnest, and humanity had drawn first blood. 6 months into the conflict, space around the expanse had transformed into something that resembled less a battlefield and more an industrial-scale abattoir. Entire star systems had become contested zones, where coalition and forces clashed in an endless succession of engagements that blurred together into a singular nightmare of violence and destruction. The psychological toll on those directing the war was almost as devastating as the physical casualties. Admiral aged visibly, his hair turned completely white, lines deepened around his eyes, and a tremor developed in his hands that no amount of medical intervention could completely eliminate. He was orchestrating the deaths of millions. Every strategic decision resulted in casualty reports that would have seemed impossible to contemplate just months earlier. 10,000 dead here, 200,000 there, 500,000 in a single engagement at the Vex Nebula. But the mathematics of the war were inexorable. For every coalition ship destroyed, 2 new ones were being built. For every vessel lost, they couldn't replace it fast enough. Dr. Sarah worked in a laboratory that had been moved 17 times in 6 months, constantly relocating to avoid potential reconnaissance strikes. She'd stopped sleeping properly months ago. Her body ran on stimulants and determination, and the absolute knowledge that if her research failed, billions would die. "The armor composite," she explained to a gathered council of coalition military strategists via secure holographic transmission, "uses a matrix structure that we initially didn't understand. But our analysis, cross-referenced with data captured from destroyed vessels, suggests they're incorporating quantum-locked crystalline lattices into the metallic base." General from the Chinese Defense Authority leaned forward. "Can we counter it?" "Yes," replied, pulling up complex molecular structures. "But it requires a completely new approach to weapons design. We need to create a resonance frequency that destabilizes the quantum locks while simultaneously overloading their energy absorption systems. It's theoretically possible, but implementation will require completely redesigning our primary weapon systems." "Timeline?" asked from his command center. 3 months for theoretical confirmation, 2 months for prototype construction, 1 month for testing and refinement, 6 months total, but that assumes no major complications." 6 months? In the context of a war where battles were being fought every week, 6 months was an eternity. But it was also the only path to overwhelming military superiority. The coalition leadership made the decision that would define the rest of the war: share everything. President, in what historians would later call the most consequential diplomatic decision of her presidency, authorized the complete transfer of humanity's military technology to all coalition allies. The gravity well manipulation systems, the faster-than-light communication arrays, the experimental cloaking technologies, everything that humanity had kept secret, developed in isolation, perfected over decades, all of it went to the Ascendant Collective and the... It was a calculated risk bordering on madness. Sharing such technology meant trusting other species with the keys to human survival itself. But it also meant that the entire coalition would benefit from human innovation. At the same time, humanity benefited from their technological contributions. They responded with advanced energy projection systems that were orders of magnitude more efficient than anything coalition engineers had previously developed. They contributed deep space navigation algorithms that allowed coalition fleets to maneuver in ways that expectations. The Ascendant Collective provided crystalline computing architectures that were revolutionary, quantum processors that could solve tactical problems in seconds that would have taken human computers hours. Within weeks, hybrid weapon systems began appearing on coalition vessels. Human-designed frames supporting energy systems and targeting algorithms. Weapon emplacements that represented the combined engineering knowledge of 5 different civilizations, all working in perfect coordination. The apparently unaware of the technological revolution occurring in coalition war-making capacity continued their strategy of grinding attrition. They seemed to believe that if they kept applying pressure, accepting losses proportional to their opponents, they would eventually overwhelm the coalition through sheer force of will and resource commitment. It was a strategic miscalculation that would cost them everything. By month 12 of the war, the casualty figures had become almost incomprehensible. The coalition had lost approximately 800,000 warships. The collective had lost approximately 1.4 million. But more importantly, the production rate was declining. Their reserve fleets were depleted. New ship classes were appearing less frequently in their formations. Intelligence reports suggested their industrial capacity was finally reaching critical limits. For the first time since New Haven fell, victory seemed possible, not just theoretically, but strategically inevitable, assuming the coalition maintained production and discipline. Admiral, reviewing the latest casualty assessments and resource projections, allowed himself something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The approach to the felt like sailing toward the gates of hell itself. Admiral stood on the observation deck of the Earth's Resolve, watching the planet grow larger on the forward displays. It was beautiful in a terrible way, a world of crystalline mountains and vast oceans, with cities that glittered like jewels across multiple continents. Those cities represented thousands of years of civilization, art, culture, and achievement. In hours, much of it would cease to exist. "Total fleet strength?" asked Commander Torres, not taking his eyes from the planet ahead. 3.2 million coalition warships in formation, sir. Assault wings positioned for breakthrough operations. Support squadrons standing by for logistical coordination. Ascendant Collective heavy platforms ready for sustained bombardment. Medical and repair vessels positioned in the rear echelon. It was the largest military force ever assembled by any civilization, and it was about to assault the homeland of an enemy that had no choice but to fight with absolute desperation. "What are their defensive capabilities?" asked. "Significant," Torres replied grimly. "Orbital platforms estimated at 40,000 major defensive installations. Planetary shield generators, we count at least 300 separate systems. Ground-based weapons batteries throughout populated regions. And their remaining fleet, approximately 600,000 confirmed contacts, is positioned in close orbit, ready to engage us the moment we enter weapons range." The trapped on there with their back literally against their world had transformed their planet into a fortress. It would be the battle that decided the war. If the coalition succeeded, the collective would be forced to surrender. If they failed, they'd lose the momentum they'd built over 18 months of grinding warfare. "All coalition forces, this is command," transmitted across every ship in the fleet. "We're about to engage the greatest concentration of enemy defenses ever assembled. Casualties will be catastrophic. Many of us won't return from this engagement, but if we succeed here, we end this war. If we fail, billions die in the years of continued conflict that follow." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "Today, we decide the fate of the galaxy. May whatever divine forces exist guide our weapons and steady our hands. Commence assault operations." The coalition fleet moved forward as a single organism. The first wave of kinetic strikes came from long range, massive projectiles accelerated to relativistic speeds that carried the force of nuclear weapons without the radiation signature. They rained down on the planetary shield generators, and the sky above the lit up with nuclear fire. Entire cities vanished in seconds. The defense platforms responded with overwhelming fury. Energy weapons, refined through centuries of military development, tore through coalition formations with devastating precision. The human destroyer squadrons took the heaviest losses, their smaller frames making them vulnerable to direct hits from planet-based weapon systems. But they kept coming. The assault wings dove through the defensive fire like raptors striking at prey, their specialized attack craft moving at speeds that made targeting difficult. They hit defensive platforms with precision strikes that were almost surgical in their accuracy. One by one, the orbital installations fell silent. The support squadrons provided covering fire, their weapons creating walls of energy that protected the advance elements from the worst of the planet-based bombardment. The ascendant collectives crystalline-hulled heavy platforms, nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, advanced inexorably toward the planet's surface, their weapons carving massive scars through the defense grid. 12 hours into the assault, the planetary shields began to fail. The impact on morale was immediate and catastrophic, for their protected for by technology they believed was impregnable, suddenly lay exposed to direct bombardment. Coalition weapons began striking at ground installations with terrifying accuracy. The fleet, fighting with the desperation of species defending their very existence, began to break formation. Their ships, battered from 18 months of continuous warfare, started to disengage rather than fight to the death. "They're retreating," Torres reported, surprise evident in her voice. "The fleet is attempting to break through our lines and establish a fallback position in deep space." Made the calculation instantly. They were abandoning there. They were choosing survival over the defense of their world. It was a critical error, the decision of a species that had lost not just the will to fight, but faith in eventual victory. "Don't let them through," commanded. "All interceptor squadrons form blocking formations. If they want to leave, they leave in coffins." The coalition forces shifted position with practiced efficiency. What had been an assault formation became an encirclement. The fleet, attempting to break through, found themselves facing an impossible wall of coordinated fire. Within 3 hours, the last organized resistance collapsed. The coalition assault teams landed on the to find cities burning, defenses silent, and a government in complete collapse. The Council of Leaders, realizing that continued resistance was futile, transmitted a single message across all coalition frequencies. "We surrender unconditionally. The collective acknowledges defeat and requests terms for cessation of hostilities." The war that had consumed nearly 2 years, that had seen the destruction of millions of warships and the deaths of hundreds of billions of sentient beings, was over. Humanity had won. The silence after surrender was almost as overwhelming as the roar of battle. President Maya stood in the Situation Room beneath the Andes, watching as reports flooded in from across coalition space. The collective's military infrastructure was systematically being dismantled. Their fleet, what remained of it, was being escorted to designated holding areas. There, by bombardment but still habitable, was being secured by coalition occupation forces. The immediate question before the unified coalition leadership was brutally simple. What do we do with them? "Execute them," General said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of millions of Chinese casualties. "The destroyed colonies murdered civilians, initiated a war that cost us hundreds of billions. Justice demands retribution." "Enslave them," suggested the commander Eth. "Make them build what they destroyed. Let them understand the cost of their aggression." "Exile them," offered the representative. "Strip them of military capability and confine them to their home system. Let them rebuild under strict supervision." President listened to the arguments, each one carrying moral weight, each one reflecting genuine suffering inflicted by aggression. But as she sat in that moment of absolute coalition power, with the capacity to dictate terms to a defeated enemy, she made a choice that shocked many. "We choose mercy," she said quietly. The room erupted in protest. How could she advocate mercy toward species that had shown none? How could she spare those who had initiated genocide? Wasn't there a moral obligation to make the pay for their crimes? Held up her hand, and the protests gradually subsided. "The collective will remain independent," she declared. "They will retain their culture, but they will be subject to strict coalition oversight. Their military will be limited to defensive forces only. They will pay substantial reparations to affected colonies and species." and they will be required to participate in a new governance structure, one that prevents any single civilization from accumulating the military dominance that allowed this war to occur. Why, demanded Minister, why show them mercy when they showed us none? Because, replied, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of 2 years of total war, if we become monsters to defeat monsters, we've already lost. The galaxy doesn't need another cycle of vengeance and retaliation. It needs healing. It needs to understand that aggression leads not to conquest, but to destruction. And the most powerful lesson we can teach is that even in absolute victory, we choose restraint. She stood slowly. We are humanity. We survived when extinction seemed inevitable. We built 700,000 warships. We civilizations that had never worked together before. We did what seemed impossible. And now, in this moment of total power, we choose to build something better than what came before. The decision would echo through galactic politics for generations. In the aftermath of victory, humanity began the long process of transformation. Dr. Sarah retired from weapons research and returned to her true passion, developing advanced propulsion systems for civilian exploration. The technology she'd helped weaponize could, she realized, revolutionize peaceful space travel. The war had accelerated human technological development by decades. It seemed appropriate to direct that acceleration toward civilian benefit. Admiral, his service complete, was appointed commander of the new Coalition Defense Force, a unified military structure designed to prevent any future threat from achieving dominance. He spent his remaining years codifying the lessons of the war into doctrine and training protocols that would guide military operations for centuries. President stepped down after 2 terms, believing that leadership should rotate and that the next generation needed their opportunity to shape civilization's future. She spent her retirement writing extensively about the moral choices made during the war, exploring the tension between justice and mercy that had defined her administration. New Haven, the colony that had started everything, remained abandoned, but a monument was erected in its orbital space, a massive sculptural work depicting an inhuman soldier standing together, their weapons sheathed, moving forward into an uncertain but shared future. It became a pilgrimage site for species across the galaxy, a reminder that even the bitterest enemies could find common ground. The 700,000 warships, the impossible armada that humanity had built in desperate months, became the foundation of the new coalition military structure. But production gradually shifted. New ships were built for exploration rather than combat. Scientific vessels were developed to study the galaxy's mysteries. Trade ships were constructed to carry goods between coalition worlds. The machinery of war transformed into the machinery of civilization. In universities across human space, students studied the war as a pivotal moment in galactic history. Historians debated whether it could have been prevented. Philosophers contemplated the moral costs of total mobilization. Military strategists analyzed the tactics that had led to coalition victory. But one point was universally accepted. The construction of 700,000 warships had been the turning point. That massive demonstration of human will and capability had convinced not just but every civilization in the galaxy that humanity was a species worth respecting. That when pressed to the wall, humans would not break. That they would innovate, adapt, and accomplish the seemingly impossible. On the 1000th anniversary of the war's beginning, President, elderly now, her hair white, her body frail but her mind still sharp, stood in the observation dome of Orbital Station Prometheus, the same location where Dr. Sarah had first discovered New Haven's silence. She looked out at the stars, at the vast expanse of space that humanity had fought so desperately to preserve. Around her, coalition citizens of a dozen different species stood in silent contemplation, remembering the war, honoring the fallen, grateful for the peace that had followed. We built 700,000 warships, said softly, because we had to. But we built something far more valuable in victory, proof that civilization could choose mercy, that enemies could become partners, and that the galaxy's future belonged to those willing to fight for it, and then wise enough to build with it rather than destroy with it. The stars shone on, indifferent and eternal, witnesses to humanity's finest moment and the beginning of a new era for the galaxy.